right, I think we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Let me bring up my little introduction so that I know what I'm going to say. Welcome to the Mid-Atlantic Invasive Plant Council's winter webinar series. My name is Damian Ossie. I'm the secretary of the Mid-Atlantic Invasive Plant Council, or MAIPC, as we sometimes say. And I'm also a wildlife biologist with the District of Columbia Department of Energy and Environment. So we're doing a short run of webinars to make up for the fact that we couldn't hold our usual workshop this summer or this fall. And today we have 3 speakers on topics ranging from an introduction to invasive species management to broad scale habitat analyses and conservation prioritization. So we look forward to today's talks. Little introduction about the MAIPC. MAIPC is a regional nonprofit organization that provides leadership to effectively address the threat of invasive plants to the native flora, fauna, and natural habitats. I think that's our official mission that I just read off to you. And we do that by hosting a biennial conference, biennial workshops like this one, by commenting on local, regional, and national issues relating to invasive plant management, and by operating an active listserv that is monitored by experts across the region. If you're not a member of the listserv and you want to join, please send an email to info@maipc.org, and I will add you to the list. We also published the Plant Invaders of Mid-Atlantic Natural Areas book. I think everyone knows a lot about that book. And we're working on a new edition for that book, and we'll be publishing it shortly. We're going to do a large publication run. So if your organization is interested in participating, there's a minimum purchase of 50 books, and you can get involved in that new print run. Please send an email again to info@maipc.org for that. The MAIPC is run by a board of directors, and I think a lot of our members are present. I'm the secretary, and a few of the other members are Nathan Hartshorn is a representative from New Jersey. Andrew Rorhbaugh will be giving a talk. He's a representative from Pennsylvania. And I just scanned through the list of participants earlier, and I think I saw Judy Fulton is the District of Columbia representative. Mark Imlay is the Maryland rep. Patricia Greenberg is Virginia rep. And I'm not sure if anyone else has joined since then, since I started talking, but those are some of our members. We're doing another webinar next week, and that's going to include our organization's business meeting. All MAIPC members are welcome and encouraged to attend that meeting. Membership is free. If you don't know if you're a member, if you attended one of our workshops or conferences in the past 2 or 3 years, then you're a member. We don't have an official paid membership anymore. So please join next week for the business meeting. We'll hold elections for the board, and we'll discuss our new small grant program that the board has been working on, and discuss the plans for the 2021 conference. We do have some openings on the board. There are vacancies for 1 New Jersey representative, 2 Delaware representatives, 2 West Virginia reps, and 1 DC rep. And then also on the executive committee, we have the opening for the technology officer. And again, you can email info@maipc.org if you're interested in joining the board on one of those positions. So we're ready to start the presentations. We'll have a Q&A session after each presentation. The chat is closed, but the Q&A tab should be open for typing in questions. Please type your questions into that tab, and one of the MCs will read them out to the speaker once the speaker is finished. So I'll introduce our first speaker. First one is Andrew Rorhbaugh. Andrew is the PA rep on the board and is a botanist with the Bureau of Forestry within the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. His talk is titled Common Invasive Plants and How to Get Rid of Them. So Andrew, you're good to go. You're still muted, Andrew.
Sorry about that. I went to share my screen and it changed the way the controls were stationed. So can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, and is my control bar showing up on your screen? It shouldn't be.
Nope.
No.
My presentation should be, hopefully.
Yeah, your presentation is showing.
Okay, so as Damien mentioned, my name is Andrew Rorhbaugh. I work for Pennsylvania's Bureau of Forestry, and for a number of you, this presentation might be a little bit of overview, things you already know, but hopefully there's some new information for some of you, and hopefully for some newer folks to the world of invasive species, there will be a lot of great information for you. So a little bit of perhaps a more of a beginner level talk, but like I said, hopefully everyone will find something useful for it. I like to start off pretty much all my presentations with this beautiful picture of native plants, not invasive plants, but these pink lady slippers, beautiful field of them. This is why we care about removing invasive plants and combating invasive plants, because we want to protect our native wild plants, such as these pink lady slippers. And my screen should, there we go. And so I like to go through a little bit of, particularly for Pennsylvania, but this holds true for a lot of the Eastern Coast. Why do we care about native plants? Why do we want to treat invasive plants and combat them in our area? Well, for my job, the Bureau of Forestry's mission is to conserve native wild plants like this yellow fringed orchid here. So, it's my job. And I think a lot of you care about the charismatic species like those pink lady slippers or these orchid species and want to keep them around. But when we look at, in Pennsylvania especially, we have almost over 3,000 plant species, and almost 500 of those are of some kind of conservation concern in Pennsylvania. So we have a lot of different species. Only about 2/3 of them are native, and then of those, probably about 500 are of conservation concern. So we want to keep those around. And so that's why I like to go through at the beginning of most of my talks. Why do we want to keep them around? Obviously, they're pretty, as some of those previous slides hopefully showed you, although not all of our native species are as charismatic and lovable as those ones. But I like to give some different examples of ways native plants benefit us. First of all, even though this foxglove is not native to Pennsylvania or even anywhere in America, it's a great example of the economic usefulness of plants. Plants don't run from predators. They can't hide from predators. They evolve thorns maybe or bark to keep predators from eating them. But oftentimes they produce novel chemicals. And so here's an example of a foxglove, which is native to Europe. They figured out it makes a poison to keep herbivores from eating it. And they realized that that chemical could be used in a slightly modified form as a heart medication. And so, without foxgloves and without keeping that foxglove species around, we probably wouldn't have found this useful chemical. And now not only do we have the chemical, but we have the genetic and biological pathways to produce chemicals like it. So things that are useful currently or things that could be useful in the future to keep around as our biotechnology improves. Like I said, that's not an example that's native to our region. So here's one that is. This looks like white clover that grows in your yard. It's actually Kate's mountain clover, a rare Appalachian mountain endemic species that grows in shale barrens, which are incredibly hot, incredibly rocky, incredibly dry, very tough growing conditions. But this is a clover that survives those conditions, fixes nitrogen, has a strong taproot to reach down into that rocky soil. And we're not there yet with our biotechnology, but you can imagine a future in which our farmers are dealing with hotter, drier conditions with in rougher soil areas where they might need some kind of cover crop like a clover species that can survive those conditions to help increase the nutrient in their fields. And here we have all those characteristics already in one package, all the genes right there. We just need to protect them and keep them around in their native habitat to be able to maybe make use of that in an economic fashion in the future. Of course, we have the idea of, Aldo Leopold's concept of the ecosystem as a watch, where, we don't quite know how it works. So as we're trying to figure it out, we should probably keep all of the parts. Um, and obviously, our ecosystems are very complicated. And so I think that it's just common sense not to think, oh, it's okay, we can lose that part, we can lose that part, we can lose that part. We want to keep all our species around and keep those ecosystems intact as much as we can. And I heard this explained a different way, where species in an ecosystem are like rivets on an airplane wing. You can certainly lose one or two or three or four of them, and that airplane wing will keep working. But how many do you feel comfortable losing before a little bit of stress on that wing causes it to fall apart while you're in flight? So I like to think of it as we want to keep all those species just out of the precautionary principle. And I'm running through this real quick because this is mostly background information here, but of course, plants are the basis of our energy or food pyramids. So they photosynthesize sunlight into chemical energy that all the other critters in the landscape, including us, depend on. And so when you start losing your native plants in an area, you start losing some of that basis of the food web. So even if you're not worried about, the different pretty plants or not so pretty plants that are in an area, that's an important basis for things that you might care about in the area. Like if you're a hunter, you might want to hunt rabbits or deer, or you might enjoy seeing wildlife on a wildlife walk out in the woods, like snakes, or maybe you don't like snakes, maybe you're scared of snakes, but you enjoy bird watching and you like to see things like hawks or eagles flying around. Those things have values to us, and without those plants supporting the base of that food web, we lose them. And I'm not going to try to do justice to Doug Talmey's work. I'm sure most people on here have heard of him. He's done a lot of work highlighting the importance of native species over non-native or invasive species in supporting caterpillars, particularly, and those native insects, which a lot of people aren't aware of, is what supports most of the bird species that we like watching out of bird feeders. I'm currently looking out my window as I give this presentation at my bird feeder. I like to watch the chickadees, but chickadees don't raise their young on seeds or nuts or any kind of vegetative material like that, like we're used to thinking of. They raise their young on insects. So they need those native plants to support rearing young, because those native plants support the caterpillars and other insects that they depend on. And almost all of our bird species here in our area are insectivores when it comes to raising their young. So they need those native plants. I really recommend, for more information, if you're not aware of that, just Google Doug Talmey bringing nature home, and you'll find some examples of his presentations online. Well worth your time to watch those. And another example of this, this is a field of garlic mustard, a non-native invasive species of plant. And speaking of those insect relationships with native plants, the picture in the bottom left is the West Virginia white butterfly. And what happens here is garlic mustard comes into areas with rich spring ephemeral wildflowers, beautiful areas to go walk through in the spring. And unfortunately, the garlic mustard puts out chemicals, allelopathic chemicals, that eradicate its competition, including our native toothwort species. And the West Virginia white would normally lay its eggs on the toothwort species. Now there's no host plant for it, so it's not doing well. Beyond the fact that there's not even any toothworts, the garlic mustard is chemically similar enough to the toothwort that it can trick the West Virginia white into laying its egg on the garlic mustard. The egg hatches and can't actually feed on the garlic mustard, and so the caterpillar starves. So our native West Virginia white butterfly is under threat because of garlic mustard. And to be honest, I give this presentation to a lot of folks, and I tell folks, you might not really care that we don't have any West Virginia whites anywhere anymore. It kind of looks like a a cabbage looper, that annoying butterfly that comes through your yard and eats all the broccoli out of your garden, and you curse it every spring like I do at my house, because I love the broccoli. So it's not really a charismatic species that maybe you have a connection to, but here's one you might, monarch butterflies. I'm sure a lot of people out there enjoy seeing monarchs, or maybe try to plant milkweed for them. And the invasive swallowwort species actually have a similar impact, where eggs can be posited from monarchs on the swallowwort species, and then the eggs cannot hatch and develop, or they cannot develop on swallowworts. So it's a source of loss of monarchs beyond just swallowworts taking over habitat from milkweed. So that's my really quick run through of a bunch of reasons why you should care about native plants, and why invasive plants are, bad, because they're taking over habitat for our native plants. So here's my really quick spiel about, how you can do something on your property or in the areas that you frequent. How can you deal with invasive plants efficiently? Because there's a lot of them out there. And in the Bureau of Forestry in Pennsylvania, we always recommend a process called early detection rapid response. So what happens is, and hopefully folks can see this, let me see if I can get this to work here. What happens here is an invasive species is introduced into an area, and you can think of this as maybe our entire eastern coast. It can be a completely new species, or this could just be your backyard. There's an introduction. It escapes people's attention for a long time until it's finally detected, and by the time most people are really aware of it, its populations have expanded. It's become a big issue, and you can see it's infested a lot of area, and the control costs are really high. So we at the Bureau of Forestry recommend that people think of early detection, rapid response on whatever scale they're thinking of. Like I said, it could be the entire eastern coast, it could be your state, it could be your township, it could just be your backyard. Go out and see what species you have in an area, and try to find those species that are just getting introduced to an area, and detect them early and treat them when it's really easy, just to pull a few plants or spray a few plants before the population runs wild and it becomes much more expensive. Here's a different way of looking at this. Say this is your backyard, and you've got a high infestation of something, maybe say barberry here. Where you want to be doing your work is out here at the fringes, and taking care of these isolated individuals doesn't take a lot of work, and you're protecting a much larger area for native wild plants, and then you work your way in to the big infestation. And that protects a larger area at first. It helps these little infestations from becoming another core area in the long term. And also, when you start working into these core areas, you're oftentimes dealing with a heavy seed bed in the seeds on the soil bank. You're working with a lot of disturbance, which churns up those seeds. You might have a lot of other invasive species that you're dealing with. So like I said, we try to suggest that people use this early detection, rapid response methodology on their landscape. And the point of all that is to deal with species when it looks like this. This is Phragmites just getting started. Before or after 10, 15 years go by and it's this. And you're just not going to get ahead of an infestation like this. Same thing with this. This is knotweed. Treat it when it's like this. It takes 15 minutes to dig out or spray before it becomes an infestation like this. So that's my introduction into a little bit of prioritization and how you want to look at the invasive species on your landscape. And now I'd like to go into some of the common species that you might find and how to deal with them. So Phragmites, the actual name is common reed, but a lot of folks just call it Phragmites. This is one that grows, it's a grass, grows in mostly wet areas, but can grow in upland areas. Likely introduced originally from ship ballast and does move around on contaminated fill. It can grow up to 15 feet in height. Really, we don't have much else in our area that grows nearly as aggressively as this. Perhaps in some of the southern states that might be on here, you've got a couple other species that might be mistaken for it, but in Pennsylvania, anywhere north, it's pretty much Phragmites is the only one that's kind of in this class and this look. It has flat grayish green glaucous leaves, and once it forms a dense infestation by spreading through its roots, it pretty much just shades out everything else in a wetland, altering that hydrology, destroying any potential habitat for wildlife. Um, and it can spread through some seed material as well. So there's a big infestation of it. You often see these along roadsides as you're driving by. You'll see this growing in the ditch. Very unmistakable. At the end of the year, it will die back to its root system. So you'll see some standing dead stalks that look like this. Here's a comparison between it and cattails. So you'll see native cattails in the foreground here of this picture, and the much taller, much more aggressive Phragmites growing in the background. Typically has a very hairy collar on the plant, but I found that can vary a little bit. And like I said about those roots, the rhizomes are incredibly aggressive. So you can see the infestation in the background of this picture slightly stunted because it was a little bit more of an upland infestation, wasn't getting its full growth like it would in a wetland environment. But you can see how that root is growing all the way under that pile of junk, all across this parking lot, looking for new habitat to invade. Like I said, there's a picture of it just getting started. And here's a quick map of what it looks like growing the infestations in our area. These maps will be from EdMaps, and I wouldn't bet a large amount of money on how accurate these are, but it does give you a pretty good picture of the overarching extent of the infestations in our area and across the country. And so the treatment for this, you can dig up the roots on some of those very small infestations that I showed, but to be honest, as soon as they get any size on them, it's just not worth the effort. So I don't recommend mechanical treatment. However, we found that the best way, and other research has shown, to deal with this is to wait until this grows in the year, about late July when it's reached its full growth, cut it back, then let it regrow. And then once it's regrown, then you can use glyphosate like Aquanit, which has been rated for use in wet conditions, not your standard Roundup. But you can use that in early fall before the plant senesces. And once it's late fall, it's going to be pulling energy down from its leaves into the root system, and it's going to pull that herbicide down with it. And so you're going to be removing some energy from the root system by making it regrow, and then you're going to be sending herbicide down to kill those rhizomes late in the year. And that's the trick, is just exhaust those root systems on these plants. You have to do repeated treatment every year, but eventually you will get ahead of it. Another species that's relatively common through the area, tree of heaven, Ailanthus, is often known by. This is the one that got a little bit famous for a tree grows in Brooklyn book, because it is very, very hardy of rough urban conditions. So it'll often be found in growing alongside roads or in urban areas, abandoned lots, railroad edges, and oftentimes that's how it spreads. The seeds, it can produce hundreds of thousands of seeds on an adult female tree, and those can spread by wind. In theory, that they are not viable in the soil past several years in the seed bank, but I have seen things on our forestry lands that make me question that, and I always take seed bank viability studies with a grain of salt. No offense to anyone here that might conduct them. I just think it's very, very variable depending on your actual soil conditions and site conditions. And this is one that's somewhat cold intolerant, so we haven't seen it in the northern tier of Pennsylvania as much, but that might be changing as weather conditions change. So identifying this one, compound alternate leaves, and really I tell people the best way is the smell. When you smell the leaves, they put off this rotten peanut butter smell. that is pretty unmistakable. You could see a sumac, one of our native sumac species, and mistake those, but all of those leaflets have serrated leaf margins. You can actually see the serration along the leaf margins here, whereas sumac typically has like one glandular tooth down here on the base, but beyond that, it's smooth along the leaflet margins. Black walnut is another one that might be similar, but once again, serrated leaf margins along the edges here, or leaflet margins, I should say, since this is all one big leaf. And ash trees also kind of look similar, except ash trees are opposite leaved. One more identification, these are the winged seeds, the samaras of tree of heaven versus the lookalike sumac, which does not have winged seeds at all. Very different fuzzy red drupes. So Ailanthus, as I said, is moving through our area. Not as common in the farther northern parts of the mid-Atlantic yet. This is another one where the mechanical removal is not really recommended. If it's one individual seedling and it's real young, you might be able to dig it up by hand, but you really need to get all the root fragments on this one so it doesn't send up root sprouts. We do not recommend cutting this species because it will regrow very vigorously and send up many root sprouts. So instead of having one tree, you'll have a dozen or 2 dozen to deal with. We do not recommend even cut stump treatment, where you cut it down to the base and then spray the freshly cut stump with herbicide. This species just does not take well with that. So what we do recommend is either a foliar application, so spraying glyphosate and triclopyr, or triclopyr I should say, on the leaves, or a basal bark treatment where you're using a triclopyr herbicide with a carrier in it designed to penetrate the bark, and you'd spray the bottom 12 to 18 inches, and that will translocate into the stem and kill the root system. Or you can do hack and squirt, where you use a hatchet and cut different sections into the bark, making sure you leave connective tissue so the tree thinks it's still alive, and then you spray high concentration of glyphosate or triclopyr into those fresh cuts. Then that will kill the root system. And it's hard to see in this picture, I'm aware, but when you look in the background, this is a timber sale that was conducted in South Central PA, where they had gone in several years before and made sure they killed all the female Ailanthus trees, thinking, give it a couple years and the seed bank will die back. Unfortunately, the seeds seem to last a little bit longer than that, and now the entire site, I shouldn't say the entire site, probably about a third of the site is incredibly highly infested with new seedlings. Autumn olive, this is a very common one to notice in the spring. It's got a shrub that grows in more open light conditions. It has silvery leaves with small scales on them, silvery new branches, yellowish white flowers, and bright red berries. Here's a picture of the flowers. Here's a picture of it in early season. You can see that silvery color is really unmistakable. And this is one that was planted by many of our agencies as a hedgerow planting for different wildlife. Now we realize that the berries, while the wildlife love them, aren't actually very nutritious for the wildlife. I've heard it likened to basically saying, if you're going to run a marathon, you need to eat healthy foods, not drink a 2-liter soda. But 2-liter soda might taste better than those healthy foods. So our wildlife goes after these berries. And it really only does well in full sun, pretty much widespread through our entire area. This one, once again, you can mechanically remove it, but you really need to take that time to control the stump sprouts that will come back up. So the Bureau of Forestry, we recommend doing a cut stump where you cut it down and then treat the freshly cut stump with a high concentration of triclopyr. And we found glyphosate most people know with Roundup, that one is not useful with this species. Japanese barberry, often another one that many people are aware of. This is one that's a very tough species, and therefore it's planted in a lot of our suburban landscaping or in our parking lots and our malls and whatnot. Very tough species. And here's what an infestation of it looks like when it's growing on some of our state forest land. This was another one that was started oftentimes as a wildlife habitat improvement species before folks kind of knew better or thought about it. The value of native wild plants as opposed to these invasives. I'm not going to spend too much time on identification, but red berries, spatulate-shaped leaves here, and thorns, which I'll show another picture of in a minute. But the yellow inner bark is really a dead giveaway that you're dealing with barberry if you're not familiar with the species. There are several different species. There's Japanese barberry with one thorn, which is most common. There is European barberry, which has 3 thorns coming out of one node. And tends to have slightly more serrated leaf margins. And at least in Pennsylvania, we used to have an Allegheny barberry, a native species, much more serrated leaf margins, those trifoliate thorns again, and bright yellow flowers on that one. So just a word of caution that, be aware of which species you're dealing with when you're looking at an infestation or an odd shrub out in the woodland, because I'd hate to think that there are just a few Allegheny barberries out there and, someone goes out and kills them because they think they're Japanese barberry. I've already mentioned a lot of this, but, there are cultivars out there that are produced that they claim are seedless. That depends on the variety, how useful that claim is. Some are truly sterile, it seems, and don't produce many seeds whatsoever. Some are sterile, but only if they are planted with the same cultivar. As soon as there's a different variety nearby, they can go back to producing seeds. And this is one that, once the branches droop, and they can root into the ground, so you can get this mass, just, impenetrable, spiny shrub layer that's really hard to get through. And what's worse is there have been some studies that have linked this species with an increase in Lyme disease because those mass drooped branches produce perfect habitat for white-tailed or white-footed mice and ticks. And of course, the seeds then are spread by birds and mammals. So very common in our area. The treatment for this one, once again, you can mechanically treat it, but you really are going to have to retreat growth that comes up from the roots and keep doing that. So what we would recommend is if you are going to do mechanical treatment, that's the first step, and it might help to mow it or burn through an area to remove some of that top growth. But you're almost always going to have to come through and retreat with herbicide. And this is one where either glyphosate or triclopyr works well. And you can do kind of all those options I've mentioned before. Foliar in early spring, before any of our native plants have really leafed out yet, is a great option. Or you can go through and do basal bark or cut stump treatments on this one. Multiflora rose. I don't have a lot of time here today, so I'm going to skip through this one pretty quick. Shrub species, once again, planted as a food opening, a wildlife species, unfortunately, before we knew better. Identification on this one is really easy once you look these fringe stipules here. We have other native rose species that grow in our area, but none of them have these variety of fringes growing off the stipule here. So once you look for that and you see white flowers, you're pretty much assured that you're dealing with multiflora rose. And here's a picture of the rose hips, the fruit, which are spread by wildlife, as well as kind of a standard way you'll see this growing in a hedgerow and an understory. Once again, this is one similar to barberry where it kind of droops over and roots at the tip. So then you get this impenetrable thorny mass. This is the one that I hate the worst when I'm trying to do any kind of field work. I would rather push through any kind of vegetation, native or non-native, except for multiflora rose, because those thorns hurt. So I've mentioned a lot of this already, but I would like to mention this is one that you can see it climbing up into trees. It's not really vining, but it does get up there and droops over other native vegetation. Very widespread in our area, and very similar to Japanese barberry is you're really going to want to rely on chemical removal for this one. But one thing to think about is if it's growing up real tall, you might not want to be spraying herbicide like this up and over the top, because you're going to get a lot of spray on other plants that you might not want to damage down here. And also, I mean, I don't know about most of you, but I don't like to spray chemicals straight up into the air practically, where they might also drift down onto my face. So I'd recommend, if you had something that looks like this, I would try to get in at the base here and do a cut stump or a basal bark treatment. But you can do the foliar spray earlier in the year when there's not as much native vegetation growing, so you won't have as much overkill there. And I'm just about running out of time, and I don't want to take up too many people's time, so I think I will end with this species right now, Oriental bittersweet, a vine species. This is one that we actually do have a native lookalike, American bittersweet, which you'll see an image of on the right. And the Oriental bittersweet is on the left. The way you can tell the native variety, the native species apart from the invasive, is American bittersweet has longer, more pointed leaves, whereas Oriental bittersweet has more rounded leaves. And in our American bittersweet, the flowers and fruit are at the ends, they're terminal, ends of the stem, whereas in Oriental bittersweet, they grow here in the axillary position in the axils of the leaves. So not here at the end. So here's some pictures of Oriental bittersweet, a very rounded leaf, fruit in the axils here. This is a challenge because they do hybridize, and it appears that the Oriental bittersweet genetics are swamping out our native species. So that can be challenging. You can find hybridized species. And here's an image of the fruit in the winter, which obviously, being a vine, being up high, is spread by birds, and they can remain viable for years in the seed bank. This is an issue partially because Oriental bittersweet can girdle tree species in an area. So here's some images of that taking place. Not quite as widespread through Pennsylvania or the Mid-Atlantic region yet, but it is continuing to spread. And for this one, once again, you can, if you have a very small new infestation, you can dig it out by hand. I have a plant that pops up every so often in my front small meadow, and I can dig it out without too much difficulty. But once again, you're going to want to try and get as much of the roots as you can so it doesn't resprout. You can do foliar application, but late in the year especially, when other native vegetation's gone dormant. So you see in this picture, the Oriental bittersweet, you could spray that while a lot of this other native vegetation won't be damaged. But once again, the challenge is spraying up that high with some of the hazards that I noted before. So you can also do a cut stump where you cut it down to the base and spray that freshly cut stump with high concentrations of glyphosate or triclopyr. Or you can do basal bark on this one with triclopyr, where you can do that year round, but you're going to get the best efficiency when you do that above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's, I think, about time for me. So I'm going to push it back to Damien, whoever wants to take over next. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions for me, please just put them in the chat box or the question box. And thank you very much. I appreciate your time today.
All right. So I'm Nathan, and I'm just going to be reading through the questions for Andrew and the other panelists to answer, should they have an answer. So from Mark, he was just asking if you had any knowledge about the new biocontrol for spotted knapweed, and if that is potentially wiping it out from certain areas.
I actually do have some knowledge about that one. I think that I don't think that it's probably gotten to the point where it is having much of an impact on the species, to my knowledge. If folks tune in next week to our next presentations, I'm actually going to be going over biocontrols that have been used for invasive plants. So I don't want to give away too much, but yes, we have done some releases of biocontrols for spotted knapweed here in Pennsylvania, and they're probably locally having some impacts, but that's hard. That's always hard to say, and I doubt that it's really been long enough to spread anywhere else, to my knowledge. There is a bit of a dearth of knowledge on biocontrols once they've been released. So I always give my presentation and tell people that I'm not an entomologist. I'm a botanist and an ecologist. So I'm coming at this kind of secondhand, and I'm always open for more information if other people have it.
All right. So Zadie asks about removing or disposing of plant material. I'll just say that personally, I know of solarization, where you put like a plastic sheet over something to get it really hot, and it will cook the seeds. It'll kill it. And then sometimes, if I've done a week of polling just one invasive and it's like purple loosestrife, I hate to do it, but I'll put it in a plastic bag and send it to the dump. Do you guys have any other ideas?
Yeah, I would always say that it depends on the species. Particularly, I know with garlic mustard, they really say if it's flowering, it's gonna produce seed even if you pull it out, even if you're trying to compost it. So if it's my property, I would definitely be bagging that in trash bags and making sure it got to the dump. With modern day trash landfills, that's going to be buried pretty deep underground pretty quickly, I think.
All right. Anne asks about aquanite. Is it usable on yellow water iris?
That's a good question. I'm not actually sure off the top of my head, but aquanite is one of the glyphosate varieties that is registered for aquatic use. So I would think that you'd be fine in a environmental sense using it for that one. I'm not sure the effectiveness on yellow iris.
Sylvan asks about prioritization of tree of heaven because of spotted lanternfly. I'll say I have read some articles where some local governments are tackling tree of heaven more because of spotted lanternfly. I also know from one of our attendees, Dan Beringer, in the audience, like what he does is he kills most of them in an area, and then when the spotted lanternfly goes to the one trap tree, he can then spray the trap tree and kill the spotted lanternfly. But it's been a real struggle for his area. Do you have anything else?
No, I will say that Ailanthus is that's pretty much what I've heard. But Ailanthus is one of our plant species that has both male and female individuals. So I know one thing they try to do is they try to kill the females to stop seed spread, but leave the males as the trap trees.
Have any of you guys experienced using these thick plastic bags? This person, Sylvan, lists as buckthorn bags on invasive woody shrubs. You just put it over and tie it over them, kill the shrub.
This is
I
Dave. I
ahead,
I haven't used them, but I'm pretty sure the Arlington County in Virginia has used them for bush honeysuckle with some success. So I think they have worked on bush honeysuckle in our region.
I actually have a forester that's looking to use those for buckthorn this year. So I will have an answer hopefully in about 2 years. Personal answer.
We have used them in a limited capacity in Fairfax County as well for bush honeysuckle and have had mixed results on them. It is important that there's follow-up if you're going to be using the buckthorn baggies, that they are removed and disposed of appropriately. once their usefulness is over with, because we don't want the plastic fragments and the zip ties to be left floating around in the environment either.
Anne asks about stilt grass and wavy leaf basket grass control.
Yes, those are ones that I wanted to get to and I was not able to due to time, but I will throw up some slides real quick here. I apologize to everyone. Stilt grass is very difficult being an annual grass species. So some different options are, you could use oust, which will basically kill everything in the understory except for trees. So I don't really prefer that as an option, but it is one way of dealing with the problem. What I would prefer our foresters do on forest land is to consider like a pre-emergent chemical like Proclips, which will keep annual species from being able to take root, but you need to reapply that every year, and it's not 100%. Depends on the weather conditions and how much other like leaf litter you have on the ground as to how well that works. But you could do that, and then you can come back maybe later in the summer and see how much emergence you've got, and consider using like a grass specific herb, like some of the ones I have listed there, where they're more expensive, but you don't use much, and you use that once or twice during the season to kill off any newly germinated plants. So wavy leaf basket grass, that's a little bit of a different kettle of fish because it is a perennial species. We've just started dealing with that in Pennsylvania. Our state parks tried one of those grass specific chemicals, Assure 2, but it was not effective. So they went back to using glyphosate, which they found worked very well because that wavy leaf basket grass is a perennial plant. So.
All right, I'm gonna do one last question. Just so you guys know, there are sometimes people just give like comments and advice in the Q&A section as well. I won't be reading those out, just some of the questions. So one person asks, Jim asks about the methodology for control where you started with the less severe areas and you did the like severe infestation area last, because you wanted to prevent those little colonies. Are there any species where you would actually do the reverse method where you'd start with the worst area?
I'm not thinking of any that I would use that approach on, but I'd be open to hearing if anyone else has any thoughts on that. It does depend on your level of resources, I think, probably in an area.
I think the only time that we might vary from what Andrew presented is if we know if there's, a special species like a rare, threatened, or endangered, possibly within that more invaded area, and we might try to, stabilize that population first. But in general, at Montgomery County, we follow the same exact method.
That's a great example. I wish I'd thought of that, but yeah, that's a great example of sometime we would go into a more heavily invaded area. And we're not looking to do eradication generally in that entire area, just some openings.
Okay, thanks a lot, Andrew, and thanks for all those great questions. We'll continue to answer questions by text if they're in the chat and they haven't been answered. But we're going to move on to the next speaker. Next speaker is Erin Stockschlaeder. She's the Natural Capital Protection Program Manager for the Fairfax County Park Authority. That's in Virginia. It's a very large park system in a large county in Northern Virginia. And her talk is assessing and prioritizing natural areas for invasive species management and restoration. Take it away, Erin.
Screen shared. Okay, so When I first started with Fairfax County, we are in the process of coming up with a strategic prioritization method for how we approach invasive species management. Like Damien said, we are a large county. We have about 24,000 acres of parkland, and many of the natural areas do have invasive species management on them. The method when I first started came to the county, we're just getting our feet wet with invasive species management, was mostly response-based. A park resident or a park neighbor would give us a call and say, you know, there's porcelain berry growing in the woods near my house. I see it every day. Can you kill it? And so we would go out and do spot treatments on these populations of invasives that were reported to us, but there wasn't really a whole lot of prioritization going on there. And also not a lot of follow-up. So we wanted something that was a little bit more long-term focus and based on some sort of established prioritization method. So we worked with a consultant, Biohabitat, to come up with a prioritization method that would work for Fairfax County. One of the other methods that they looked at was from Seattle called the triage analysis, and I really like the naming on here. And the triage model is heavily influenced the model that we use in Fairfax County, where there are different levels of threats and also different levels of remediation or restoration that are going to happen according to those different threat levels. So how do we maximize our results for limited resource dollars? We're all natural resource specialists here working in this field, and we know that there is never an unlimited pot of money from which to pull from for doing invasive species management. So we want to make sure that we're being strategic and thoughtful in where we're spending these limited funds. That's most of the time is going to mean working in the best natural areas first. In those areas, we can go in, make a smaller investment and get more bang for our buck. We want to make sure that we're being efficient. So preventing and stamping out fires or early detection rapid response species will make the job easier in the long run. We also want to make sure that we're being realistic, planning for the resources that we have. I took this text box out of the report from Biohabitats to highlight, in a perfect world, the funding that we would need for invasive species control. As you can see, we're looking at almost $70 million needed for invasive species management just in the first year of treatment on those 24,000 acres that we have. Unless the Park Authority starts playing the Powerball, we probably are not going to have that $70 million being put our way towards invasive species management. So we have to be smart about where we're spending the limited fraction of that we do have. So we talked about this a little bit in the last presentation, and it's important to focus on prevention. So preventing new infestations from coming into the county, but also prioritizing the invasives that we already have. So protect the best has become our motto in implementing the invasives control strategy that we came up with for Fairfax County. So out of that study done by our consultant, the non-native invasive assessment and prioritization was born, or the NNIAP for short. This survey is being done by summer interns every year. We hire a pair of interns, equip them with an iPad that has the form that you see here in our collector. So they're able to collect the data out into the field. It has 3 different categories which they are scoring. The ecosystem score is looking at the native diversity, both of trees, the herbaceous and the shrub level, and it's also looking at the disturbance. And disturbance can be anything from deer browse, stream erosion, wind damage, etc. And it's also looking at the non-native invasive species, and in that category, it will be looking at the percentage of the invasive species but also how hard they are to control. And lastly, we're going to look at the cultural value score. This is a measure of how people are going to perceive this treatment. Because we are a public agency, we do want to consider our where the public is seeing these things and do projects that aren't just in the middle of vast tracts of land that won't be noticed by the public, even though those do tend to have some of the nicer forest stands. We do want to take in consideration where people are actually spending their time in our parks. So the score can range from 3 to 16, with 16 being a pristine, intact, forested environment with nature trails through it and very few invasive species. And the 3 being an area that's covered in porcelainberry and wisteria, not a whole lot of native diversity there, and it may be tucked away out of sight. So this is a scoring guide that was developed and which we use as a reference. And this goes into a little bit more detail about how we take into account those different scoring systems. And I'd be happy to share this with anybody that's interested. So it talks more about the ecosystem score, the non-native invasive species score, and the cultural score. So in Fairfax County, we have a heterogeneous landscape when it comes to the quality of our natural areas. And I put this slide up here to show you how the different scores are spread out across a small part of the county. So each color on there, it represents a different range of scores. And as you can see, there's some really nice parts there in the 13 to 16 range, which are at the very tippy top of the NAIP scoring system. And we also have some 3 to 4s, which are at the very, very bottom of the NAIP level. And even within one park, it's possible and likely to have a wide range of habitat value. This is just one particular park, and you can see that there are higher scoring areas. It looks like there's a 12 and 11 in this park, but also some 4s and 6s. So once we have this data, we are able to make decisions about where we are going to be treating. And you may notice that these are irregular shapes. So when the interns are out doing their survey, they are looking for management units. So as the forest type is changing, they're going to start making a different polygon and assign it to a different score. So these polygons are all determined in the field based on actual field conditions. So large differences exist between and even within the parks regarding the ecological health of the resource. And I put these pictures up here to illustrate what we might be seeing in a different range of scores. So the mature trees that you see in the left-hand picture with an intact understory, that would be representative of a higher scoring park. So perhaps an 11, 12, or maybe even 13 there. And then the picture on the right would be representative of a lower scoring park. I believe that in this particular picture that there is porcelainberry and also mile a minute growing. We can see that there's not a whole lot of tree canopy in this section that it looks like in the distance. There may be a different management unit there where there is more mature trees, perhaps fewer invasives growing in the shade. But the focal point here is going to be a lower scoring range, so perhaps a 4 or a 5. So it took 6 years in order for all of our parks to be surveyed, all the natural areas within our parks to be surveyed. And once we had all that data, we were able to see that we had a typical bell curve distribution. We had several parks at the higher end, and we also had several parks at the lower end, or excuse me, management units within those parks, and then a whole lot going on in the middle. So we began our maintenance program by treating the higher parks first. So parks that were a 12 to 13 were prioritized first. I believe the highest scoring park that we had was a 13.5. I don't think we had any perfect 16s going on there. But we were able to begin treatment at the top of that range and work our way down. Though as we go down the bell curve, we get more and more management units that will need treatment. So it's a slower process working backwards. On the other end of the scale, those management units that were highly degraded with lots of invasive species that scored in the 3, 4, 5 range, we developed another restoration program called Helping Our Land Heal. And that project, or that program, was able to take on larger scale restoration projects. And I'll talk more about those at the end of the slideshow. So this is a park called Fairfax Villa that scored fairly high. The majority of the park was a 14. And if there were a live audience, I'd ask what you thought was going on in the right-hand part of the park and why maybe it was scoring a little bit lower there. But since it's not live, I'll just tell you there's a stream going through there. And in Fairfax County, we often find that with stream corridors, we find increased disturbance levels. There's also a stream valley trail that goes through there, increased invasive species, and also increased disturbance from the stream and the property borders with the neighboring homes. However, we really wanted to protect those areas that were high quality, high value, the 14s. So this is a park that has been treated. It first was being done every year for a couple of years, and it's no longer necessary to do a yearly treatment. And now it's been put into a monitoring regime where it's looked at every 2 or 3 years and only treated as necessary. This is a picture from that park from the area that's a 14. We have mature trees here, a shrub layer, and we also have oak regeneration and some nice herbaceous perennials coming up as well. And then these are pictures from along the stream where it did score a little bit lower. There's silk grass in that area, which is unfortunately typical of stream valleys, multiflora rose, barberry, and also some autumn olive along that stream valley. So this is another park that we have done treatments on, and I stuck this in here to show the change that can happen over time. So as I mentioned, we got through our first round of scoring using the NNIAP protocol with interns in 2016. And we have moved on to rescoring areas with interns. So we're going back to the parks that were first scored in 2010, 2011, and seeing how those numbers have changed over time. What we would hope would happen is that parks that we treated would either keep their same higher scores or perhaps get even higher scores because they're going to have fewer invasive species. And we also expect parks that have not been treated to get even lower on that scale. So a 7 perhaps would go down to a 4 or a 5 without treatment. And then that argument can be used to justify additional funding as our resources will continue to degrade without the investment. So this park, the orange, oops, go back. There we go. So the orange section in the lower left-hand side was a higher scoring piece. I believe that it was scoring a 10 or 11 when we treated it. The pink polygon represents a treatment plan that we gave to our contractor and said essentially treat the entire park. And then we can see when it was resurveyed several years later, that orange turned into yellow, which signifies that the treatments or the score went up, and we can assume that the habitat value went up accordingly with that. So here's some of those individually. So the yellow or the orange area, let me see if I can find my pointer here. I'm not sure if you guys can see that, but I'll keep going. The orange area, it says it was scored in the 11 to 13.5 range originally. And it went up to the 13.5 to 16 range, which is exactly the change that we would like to see after having received an investment from the Park Authority by herbicide management. So that is our maintenance part of the restoration programs that we have, where we are able to go in and do limited herbicide control and not have to do a full-scale replanting, since we're just treating those higher value areas. At the other end of the scale, we do need a larger investment and more hands-on management, and that's where our Helping Our Land Heal program comes in. This was originally a pilot project that started at one of our flagship parks, Eleanor Lawrence, and it's a coordinated effort that includes educational programs and field trips, recruiting volunteer, and building support for management activities that may not always be as palatable to the public. These could include cutting down mature trees to create gaps in the canopy for oak and hickory regeneration, and also deer management. So Helping Our Land Heal program is going to be focusing on sites like this that have carpets of invasive species that are just not manageable with a smaller short-term investment through limited herbicide control. These sites are going to be highly degraded, have carpets of invasive species, and really need a much firmer approach. And some of these techniques can include forestry mulching. So in the upper left-hand corner, that was a thicket of autumn olive and cedars. And in order to bring it back to the grassland that we were envisioning for, and it historically was a grassland, it was necessary to go in there with a forestry mulcher and essentially level everything that's there. And on the right, burning or prescribed fire is another one of the tools that we use to maintain these areas. And these photos are both from Poplar Ford Park, which is in Chantilly. So after the area is leveled and the invasive species are treated, we're able to go in and do a large scale planting. This site included the planting of the rare species purple milkweed, and we also did hardwoods as well. I mentioned the educational component of that program, and that's been very important. This poster was developed in order to help out with that, and it was distributed to schools in Fairfax County for teachers to use as part of their curriculum. On the left-hand side, it shows all sorts of activities that we do not want to encourage in parks, including encroachment, feral cats, stream erosion, deer overpopulation, invasive species. I could go on. It's almost like a Where's Waldo game. And on the right-hand side, it's all the activities that we do want to encourage and what our park should look like. We still have deer in there, we still have pets, we still have people enjoying the park, but it's from a much healthier viewpoint. So the NIAP data has also been used recently as part of a countywide effort and study on equality. So we are overlaying this data with data that we have on public health measures, such as asthma and access to food stores, for example, to see where those overlaps are occurring. And this has just started, so I don't have any results from that study yet, but it's going to be really interesting to see if there's any overlap between where our healthy forests are and where there may be some public health issues or non-issues in Fairfax County. And then we can use that data in order to make better decisions about where we would want to do more trail networks, provide more access to certain areas, and encourage people to get out in our parks. So the NIAP data is used for a proxy for forest quality, using only the first two scoring measurements. So the ecosystem and the invasive species scores combined. So the cultural score is not being used in our proxy for forest quality. And I think that's all I have. I'm happy to answer questions.
All right. Yeah, we have a lot of good questions. So let's see. How often are the NNIAP scores updated?
So that's a great question. As I mentioned, we have about 24,000 acres of parkland. It took us approximately 6 years to get through surveying all that with summer interns for the first round. So the first year or two was a slower start because we weren't hiring interns yet to do it. So we're figuring that it's going to take about 4 or 5 years to get through a full rotation. So every 4 or 5 years, we would hope to be able to resurvey.
All right. Ed, do you, is there a way that people can access these scores and these maps? Are they shared?
These maps are not currently publicly available, though they are available to all of Fairfax County employees. So they are available to planners, for example, from our Department of Public Works and Stormwater. So they can use this data when they are planning for stream restoration or other infrastructure projects.
All right. When you guys prioritize and you prioritize based on invasives, do you ever also use like the native communities to prioritize?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. That's another project that the Park Authority is working on, is doing community classification. That is rolling out now. We have several areas of the county done. We call it the western part of the county, so the Chantilly complex is mostly done as far as community classification. That's going to take a little bit longer. We do have some full-time staff working on that. But the NNIP is more of a rapid assessment. So it can go in there, be done by summer interns. We're figuring each management unit should take about 20 minutes to walk through. The community classification is more in depth. They have to do a much more thorough survey. The people doing it have to be a lot more knowledgeable of both non-native and invasive plants, non-native and native plant species. So that is in the works. And we anticipate that should be done in another couple of years. And we are overlaying that data with the NNIP data where it's available.
What is the white-tailed deer management program like?
So Fairfax County works with the police departments, and there is an archery program.
How effective do you think it's been?
In the areas where it has been ongoing, we do deer browse plot studies and analysis, and it has shown, I believe, to have some effectiveness on native plant regeneration.
Back to the maps. We noticed that sometimes in the same park, the polygon shapes were different over time. What was the reasoning behind that?
Sure. So as I mentioned, these polygons are made on the ground in the field as management units. So over 5 years, it is logical that a management unit may have shifted. Maybe an invasive species has moved into a canopy gap, and therefore just that canopy gap is going to be a management unit where 5 years ago, those invasive species didn't exist there. Maybe the canopy gap wasn't even there. So the management units would have been different previously.
All right, thank you. Damien?
Do we have time? Is there time for a few more questions? I see there's a few more in there for Erin.
Oh, maybe they keep getting added as I go, and they don't organize very well in the Q&A.
I can read one.
Okay, go for it.
Renee says, very cool mapping tool, Erin, and has a couple questions. How, so you might have already answered these. How often are NNIAP scores updated? Do those scores get published publicly that we can explore them? And 3, do they get shared with IMA leaders?
Can you read the last part?
Do they get shared with IMA leaders? I don't know what
Yes.
that acronym.
Yep. So they typically do get shared with IMA leaders, and we are working on getting this to be more publicly accessible. We have a crunch in our GIS departments, and there does need to be some QC work done. The format is not, it's only available right now in ArcGIS software. So in order to make it publicly available, we would have to convert that, and that's where the crunch is right now.
Okay, and then Bill Hamilton asks, Erin, what qualifications do you require or look for in your inventory interns?
So these are typically college students. We are looking for people that are in some sort of natural resources, forestry, ecology, undergraduate degree program. Being able to work independently is hugely important, as they are going to be spending the summer off in the field without direct supervision for most of the time. Some basic plant ID knowledge is definitely helpful, though we do training at the beginning of the year in order to get those interns up to speed. We also bring them to different parks that have already been scored and have them do practice rounds there. So having some basic knowledge of non-native invasive plants and plant ID is hugely helpful, and also some sort of background or classes in ecology. But we're not looking for trained botanists. These are our college students.
A couple more. Ann Kearns asks, wouldn't a high cultural score be a reason to treat a severe infestation before outlying colonies? Put in parentheses, reverse priorities question at the end of Andrew's talk.
So that's a great question. And that has come up before, where there has been an area that had a very high cultural score. So there was already a volunteer program there, and it had high visitorship, but maybe it also had a wisteria infestation and the diversity wasn't so great there. We are looking at this, we are looking at that final number. So if that high cultural value score is going to bump up the score into the range that we are treating, we would treat it regardless whether or not it is going to be more difficult ecologically. Because like I said, as a public agency, we do take seriously our duty to do things, not just from in the areas that are going to have the most diversity. Those are often, as I mentioned, they can be buried and away from the public eye. And I do think it's important to consider areas that are important to the public and areas that the public see. So in some cases, yes, it may be different priority than someone looking at it from a purely ecological view would have.
Okay, there's two more that I'll pass on. One is from an anonymous attendee. They ask, is the Healing the Land available for distribution? I guess maybe the data for Healing the Land, or I'm not sure what.
Yes, so we have a website. If you Google Fairfax County Helping Our Land Heal, there is a website, and I believe that poster that I shared is available on the website. And we also have some educational videos that we've made talking about some of the different practices that are available on there, as well as case studies on the projects that Helping Our Land Heal has done.
Okay, thank you. And then the last one from Glenn Tobin. What is the approach to linking volunteer efforts to the herbicide treatment approaches? Integrated approaches, manual plus chemical, have been shown to be more effective.
Sure, and that's definitely something that we consider. We do have a really robust volunteer program called the Invasive Management Area Program, where volunteers focus on removing non-native invasive species through manual control. These IMA sites are typically set up in spots that have species that respond well to manual control. So we wouldn't be asking volunteers to remove wisteria or bamboo, for example. If they need herbicide support, if there is a bush honeysuckle that is too large for them to take out, for example, then we would work with them to get them that herbicide that they need. So they definitely do work hand in hand and help to make Fairfax County's invasive program really a success. That is, we would not be able to do as much land management and resource protection restoration if we did not have our large group of volunteers working with us as well.
All right, great. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
And thanks for all those great questions from the audience. Next up, we have Ryan Colliton. Ryan is the Principal Natural Resources Specialist or Vegetation Ecologist from Montgomery County Parks. It's in Montgomery County, Maryland. Also a very large county with a very large park system. And he's going to be talking about incorporating invasive species in natural resources decision-making. Take it away, Ryan.
Give me 1 second here to get everything up. Okay, can you see that presentation?
Yeah, I can see it.
All righty. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to attend this. I'm relatively new to the area, and I feel like this organization is going to be a very useful resource for us in Montgomery County, and I look forward to any collaboration that we can do together in the future. The issue of going third behind these two amazing previous presenters is that they covered to a degree much of what I'm going to cover, but hopefully there will be some nuance in the way that Montgomery County Parks do things that might raise questions for you or help you to think about things in a little bit different way. But we'll get started. As Damien said, Ryan Colliton, Principal Natural Resources Specialist, for, Vegetation Ecologist for Montgomery County Parks. And since I am new to the area, I'd just like to tell you a little bit more about myself. I started here in the fall of 2019 with the park systems, been in natural resources management for about 18 years. All of that was spent in the state of Michigan with a focus on habitat conservation and restoration. Studied environmental science and forest ecology in school, as well as have certifications in RX fire, wetland delineation, and stream restoration. And that photo up on the right there is of eastern Massasauga rattlesnake habitat, which is a federally threatened species, and that we were maintaining tallgrass prairie habitat for its summer forage area. And then down on the bottom there is about is a picture from my about second or third week of work when we were doing NNI or non-native invasive trainings for park staff that were helping us in our efforts to control NNIs on their properties. And I have to tell you, being that new, that was pretty intimidating, but we definitely appreciate the park staff that support our efforts to conserve and restore our natural areas. So what do you need to do to consider invasive species in natural resources management decision making? The first thing you need to do is obviously have a clearly defined goal, right? You need to know why you're doing what you're doing. So for Montgomery County Parks Vegetation Management Unit, that goal is the conservation of biological diversity, which includes flora and fauna through vegetation management. And there's two specific ways that we do this. One is through habitat prioritization, and ours is very, very similar to Fairfax County's, which makes me feel even more comfortable about the direction that we're taking it, that other agencies are doing it as well. And then we also practice something called adaptive management. So habitat prioritization kind of gives us that where are we going to work? And adaptive management is who's going to do the work, what are we going to work on, and when are we going to work on it? And I'll get into those in a little more detail here as I go to these next slides. So somebody asked the question to Erin, do you consider, other factors besides invasive species coverage and prioritization? In Montgomery County, and I'm sure in Fairfax County they do as well, but we consider the factors listed here, and I just kind of want to give you a broad overview of everything that goes into it before I focus specifically on invasive species. So we consider things like the size of the management unit, because that's important for resources and wildlife and plant populations. The more resources they have, the larger populations, the more resilient they're going to be. We do consider native floristic diversity, watershed use category, which is a Montgomery County specific categorization. So that would be things like cold stream trout waters on one end to recreational waters on the other end. And then of course the big topic, invasive species coverage. We consider rare, threatened, and endangered species, the habitat rank. So Maryland Natural Heritage Community, if you can see on the right, there is a photo of their document, and that has all the habitats that exist in Maryland. And it comes with a state rank and a global rank. And so we use those to help prioritize, to make sure that, as the previous presenter said, that we are working in the best of the best. We also consider our edge to interior, trying to conserve core habitat to the best of our ability. That would also, relate to, obviously, as you know, fragmentation relates oftentimes to invasive species coverage. Connectivity is another measurement of fragmentation. And then we do also consider unique features within the vegetation matrix. So are there things like pools, seeps, and springs that would kick up the habitat to a higher ranking? And so what we do is we give each of these categories a range or classification, and those are given a score of 1 through 5 for a given management unit. And then depending on how the level of importance that we apply to all of these, they will be multiplied by a weighted value. And that gives us our total rank. And what this really helps to do is sort of differentiate the best of the best from each other. So you're not going to get a bunch of high, medium, or lows. You're going to have scores from that will be like 5.3, 5.25, whatever the case may be. And that really digs down in the details, because one of the issues that I've seen at other places that I've worked is, you do the groundwork to get, we know these are good habitats, and we know these are medium habitats, and we know these are low quality habitats, but where do you start in all those high quality habitats? So getting in a little more detail, this really helps differentiate those scores and really removes a lot of that overlap, giving us a clear picture of sort of how to move forward through our prioritizations. And I adapted this through a method that's called analytical hierarchy. There's a book out, Analytical Hierarchy, Decision Making Using Analytical Hierarchy in Natural Resources and Environmental Decisions. I don't think I got that title exactly right, but if you look up Analytical Hierarchy, if you're interested, Analytical Hierarchy and Natural Resources, you will find the book if you Google that. So the other thing that we use is adaptive management. And the idea of adaptive management is that, you establish your management goals, which we've already done, and the objectives, and then you identify threats to those, consider control options, develop and implement a plan, monitor and assess impacts, and then use that information to make any changes that you may need. So it's just a circular cycle, and you go through it. And this gets back to the question that was asked about how often do you go back and resurvey these areas? When we go back and resurvey, that's when we'll do our adaptive management and see, are we making the impacts that we claimed we were going to make when we set up our objectives? And this is from Weed Control for the Preservation of Biological Diversity. If anyone's interested, I believe you can also find that online. But now to the meat and potatoes of the presentation, invasive species prioritization. First and foremost, why do we care about invasive species? And I know most of this is information that you all know, but I think it's important to set the groundwork. So excuse me if I'm just repeating things that you already know. But here we go. Invasive species are considered the second leading threat to species extinction at a local scale. Now, oftentimes, being that I've basically worked in parks for the majority of my career, or at least in areas where the development footprint was pretty stable. I know sometimes parks will develop new facilities and clear new land, but most of the time what we're doing is replacing old infrastructure on the existing footprint with new infrastructure on the existing footprint. So I often make the argument that for those of us in parks or, you know, working at preserves or areas like that, that in fact, invasive species are probably the leading threat at a local scale. And then both as Andrew and Erin mentioned, you know, they can have explosive population expansion, and getting to them while that population is small is the most efficient and economical way, rather than waiting for the population to expand or wait and see if the species causes any impact. I've often heard, you know, people say, well, it doesn't seem to be invasive for certain species that are non-native. But the fact of the matter is, oftentimes we don't know where on that invasive species curve that Andrew shared that species may be. It might not seem invasive at the time simply because it's a relatively new introduction and it hasn't hit that rapid population expansion yet. Ecologically, potential legacy impacts. I studied forest soils, and the research that I did was on the impact of garlic mustard on soil microbial communities and nitrogen and carbon cycling in the soils. But obviously it's not limited just to soils. Legacy impacts could be impacts to wildlife, as we've heard mentioned earlier, or to vegetation structure, and I'm sure there's many others. Invasive species alter ecosystem processes. You know, for example, autumn olive is a nitrogen fixer. So it comes into a habitat that didn't have nitrogen fixers. Obviously, it's going to alter the nitrogen process in that habitat. And the biggest one for the goal that we stated earlier in the beginning of the presentation is dominate and displace native species. So that is the biggest threat for us if we're to achieve our goal. And then others impacting forest regeneration and hybridizing with native species, which I feel was covered pretty well earlier. So I'm going to move right along. I just wanted to share this resource with you as well. This is my go-to book for anything invasion ecology. It's by Julia Lockwood out of Rutgers University. I believe there's a second edition out now, but I mean, my book has underlined notes in the margin, highlighted, pages folded over, pages falling out because I've used it so much. And it's right there by my desk every day if I ever need a reference. So I just like to share the information that has gotten me where I've gotten in my decision-making with folks if they'd like to review it as well. So now that, you know, we've discussed why invasive species are important, we now have to get to the real work of prioritizing our invasive species. And how do we do this? As you've seen in the other presentations, we need to do baseline surveys. We need to know what we have before we know how we're going to react to it, right? And we do this through species prioritization. So we do our surveys, and then number two, we need to do our species prioritization. And I like to consider this by habitat. You can imagine that a species, while invasive, may not behave the same way in a dry acidic habitat as it may in a more mesic basic habitat. Garlic mustard is a fantastic example of that. Coming from the Midwest with rich, deep soils all over the place, garlic mustard is prolific. After coming to the Piedmont out here, you know, the drier areas tend to be have a little more resistance to garlic mustard invasion, and we're finding it more in the floodplains and areas like that. So we're trying to prioritize species by habitat, and there's many ways you can do this. As has been mentioned time and time again, resources vary. And pretty much anyone doing natural resources management does not have all the resources they're going to need to do everything they need to do or want to do. But you can kind of ease up the burden on your resources by using things like subject matter experts. So groups like this, reaching out to groups like this and saying, hey, here's where I'm working. Based on your professional experience, how would you rank these invasive species that I'm dealing with in this type of habitat? Or maybe you do this work yourself. You already have that personal experience. That is a completely adequate way to go about prioritizing species, as long as you stay on top of the most current information. And then there's other things like assessment protocols, a lot of which are available online for free. And the one that I'm going to share with you, I believe some of the folks on the call today, our participants today, actually had a hand in drafting this. But the goal is opposite of habitat, which is protect the best of the best, right? With N&I control, we're looking to control the worst of the worst. And just to give you an example of how we collect our field data on invasive species. So this is a field log. We have digitized this in GIS, so we can take our collector app out in the field and we don't have to use this paper format, but you could use this paper format with a handheld GPS. It's very simple. Again, trying to limit the amount of resources and the speed in which we can get these things surveyed and get at least trend data that will be useful for us moving forward, and sort of assessing our successes or failures when we go back through our adaptive management cycle. And so just briefly what this does, each species that you run transects through your management unit, and each species that you come across gets a unique identifier, and then you give it area and density ranking. And then you can also go further and give it treatment status, whether it's been treated or untreated. We typically skip that part, because what we'll do is just overlay this layer with our treatment polygons, which our staff collects for every project that we do. And we can see that, if we were targeting woody N&I and that treatment layer overlaps those points that we collected, then we know that we can consider those treated and go back and assess. This is from one of your counterparts in the Midwest, and I mentioned garlic mustard. That's why there's specifically a column there for number of bags, portion of bag removed, because it's such an issue out there in the Midwest. Here's an example of the invasive species prioritization protocol. This is from NatureServe, evaluating non-native plants for their impact on biodiversity. And now, if it was a little difficult to understand when I was just talking about how we use a weighted rank to come up with our overall prioritizations, hopefully this graphic here will help you, because this assessment protocol does the same thing, but just for invasive species. So you can see at the top on the right there, ecological impact is 50% of the rank score. That is the same way that we do our overall prioritization matrix in Montgomery County. So each of those each of those different categories has a weighted rank, and it is a specific weight for the total score. They also consider current distribution and abundance at 25% of the weighted score, trend and distribution and abundance at 15%, and management difficulty at 10%. I appreciate that management difficulty is on there. I appreciate the questions about, attacking those areas that are really bad. One of the things, I guess, one of the caveats that I would add to that is we can't turn our backs on difficult problems just because it's easier to solve the easier problem. If we do that, what we're going to be left with is nothing but difficult problems. So if a difficult problem is within our high priority management unit, and we have the resources to tackle it, even though it may take some time, a lot of dedication, we are going to try to tackle that difficult problem if it is a threat to one of our high quality natural management units. So after we've done all this prioritization, we can then move to invasive species control. And that's going to be determined by the available resources. But first we need to establish our underlying objectives. And I think it's really important that people understand that to track your progress, to be able to show, whether it's leadership or the public or anyone else, that you are making progress, that your objectives underneath your goal must be measurable and achievable. And what do I mean by that? It might sound a little more complicated than it is, but so here's a very basic example. We have a made up management unit here, and we want to control 50% of the autumn involved in that management unit within the next 2 years by 2020. It's simple, it's measurable, achievable. It's a realistic goal. That is if you have the resources. So I understand a lot of people out there might not understand what their resource capability is. So what I would recommend in that case is to start lower, start at something you know you can accomplish, and then ramp it up from there. One of the other things that I like to point out is that just because we've prioritized something doesn't mean that that's the only thing we're working on. And a lot of that has to do with the seasonality of invasive species management, right? If we get that, if we're able to get what we need to get done in this, a made up management unit above, in 25% in 1 year, and we still got time in the season to where we're controlling woody N and I, we're not just going to wait around for the next season, maybe where we control Japanese stiltgrass. We're going to move on to priority number 2. And if we have time after that, we'll move on to priority number 3. And then we'll shift to the next seasonal priorities. So the goal is not to just find the best of the best and limit yourself to that. You can spread out your resources if you have them over multiple priorities. And the goal here is that, invasive species is really a percentage game. You have to control more than the rate of expansion at a minimum to hold things the way they are. And hopefully you'll have the resources to control more than that, so you can start a negative population trend for your targeted species. Uh-oh, froze up, guys. There we go. All right. And then that brings us to on-the-ground invasive species. Now, Andrew did a phenomenal job talking about this. I knew of that graphic. I couldn't find it, though. But yes, work from the invasion front to the invasion core. And as Andrew said, because you don't want your invasion front to become your invasion core. If once you get rid of that front, you don't have to worry about that anymore, and you can focus on your invasion core. We do work towards local extirpation, and I believe Erin called it maintenance phase as well. And then the good thing about getting to a maintenance phase is this is when you can start expanding your influence on the landscape, right? When you're in the maintenance phase, you can begin to put your resources towards other priorities. So now you're systematically moving down your list of priorities. The caveat to that is just because you're in a maintenance phase does not mean you can turn your back on that area that you got into a maintenance phase. The good news is that you should return at regular intervals, but if you're at a maintenance phase, it would require little or hopefully no effort to maintain, right? So we use a lot of contractors at Montgomery County Parks. This would be a situation where maybe myself and one of my staff would go out, with a backpack sprayer or whatever device we need to control whatever species. And instead of taking us, half a season to control, now we're down to 2 people can go out for a couple hours and just make sure everything's still okay. Maybe do a little spot treatments and we'll be all right. But the bulk of those resources can now be applied to the next priority down the list. And we often talk about, invasive species, prioritizing them on the ground management. But I think one thing that's also very important to consider is, what are you doing with this information? And Andrew mentioned one of my favorite people. He gave a quote from Aldo Leopold. One of the ones that I'm very fond of is think like a mountain. However, I've never worked in the mountains, so I always change it to think like a forest, right? The forest is going to be there much longer than myself. I will probably be retired, and the forest management will continue, right? So one of the things that I think is very important is what you do with this programmatic information. And we're going through an effort right now to make sure that we digitize and centralize all of that important information. So this will make it easier for us to track progress. It'll make it easier for us to practice adaptive management. And if we have any staff changes or leadership changes, it'll allow continuity. People can pick it up, they can come in, they can pick it up, and they can see what we've done, why we've done it, make any changes that they feel necessary, but still know, you know, the trajectory of the program. So I feel like that's very important if you are going to think like the forest, because the forest is going to be here long after our professional careers have ended and we're in Florida on the beach enjoying our retirement. One of the other things that, you know, we talk about the availability of resources and the limited resources that we have. So something that was started and continues before my employment with Montgomery County was providing guidance to the staff in BMPs for natural areas management. NNIID sessions, and at those sessions we discuss clean equipment and clean employees, so we're not working on a problem over here and taking it to the next site on our equipment or our clothes. They help us with our meadow management program, and then we help them if they want to put funding towards NNI projects in their parks to help, you know, with the projects that we're working on, which they often do. We will do site visits and consultations with them and say, you know, we recommend that you work on this in this area. It'll be of a benefit to the work that we're already doing. We're also compiling very basic, and they're very basic annual reports, but just to use as a record of work completed. You can use it, you know, if you can show that you're getting all this work done, you can use that to advocate for more resources and again, provide for program continuity. But these can be very simple. You know, where did we work? How much time did we spend on it? How much money and how much work did we get done? It doesn't need to be, you know, much more than that. It doesn't need to be a giant document, you know, a tome of all this different stuff. It just literally report of all the things you did and the resources that went into it and the results of it. One of the other ways we expand our resources, and I know Fairfax talked about this as well, we have the Weed Warriors program. So by using volunteerism, we're able to basically recruit more people to work on this very serious problem of non-native invasive species. And my predecessor created the Weed Warriors. It is an extremely robust volunteer program, which is focused on NNI control. And our hope is that in the future, we'll expand opportunities towards these Weed Warriors volunteers, where they'll be able to do more surveying, as well as get we've always sort of provided them with native seed and native materials to put back in to areas where they've removed invasive species. And, you know, if it's highly invaded, you're kind of left with a blank slate, right? So we want to give them things to put in, try to formalize that a little bit more for them. And they seem to really, really enjoy that. But I just would like to take a moment to thank our Weed Warriors. If there are any on the call today, during a pandemic, they put in over approximately 6,700 hours of volunteer services in 2020. This does not include any groups or anything like that. These are people who went out on their own, maybe with a friend or two, and we're still able to reach that average number of hours even during a pandemic. So if there are any Weed Warriors on the call today, thank you so much for your efforts. I cannot express how greatly appreciated they are. And now you see the invasion curve again. So I'm not going to harp on this too much because I think Andrew did much better than I could do, but EDRR is essential. You know, invasive species are continuing to be introduced, and for the foreseeable future, that will be the case. So it is, yes, important from an economic, from a likelihood of success standpoint, from an ecological protection standpoint, to hit those species on the lowest end of the curve as possible. With that, I will skip the rest because it's already been covered. So what do we do with all of this information that we collected? In vegetation management in Montgomery County, we do have a comprehensive vegetation management plan that was created in 2009. And all this information that we're using, or excuse me, collecting now, will be used to inform updates to that document. And again, this is another way that it doesn't matter who's in my position or whatever position. This is a document that anyone can pick up and start, know where we were at and know where we were headed and pick up and run with it if they come into the program. With that, because I feel like I threw a lot of information at you, I just want to take a brief second to sort of go through the summary. So you must know what your goal is. Then you need to gather your baseline data, establish your priorities based on that baseline data, assess your resources so you can define measurable and achievable objectives, execute your plan, and monitor the results of that. And then getting into adaptive management, if you see that you are not reaching the results that you intended to reach, you can either scale back a little bit because maybe those measurable and achievable results you set weren't actually achievable. Maybe you scale back, or maybe you realize it's the time of year that's your chance to adapt and do things a little different to readdress the situation. And again, like I said, I think it's very important to record and sort of find a centralized location to keep all these records to promote continuity. And again, in adaptive management, rinse and repeat. Go back to after you've done management, like Erin said, maybe 5 or 6 years, go back and review the progress that you made. With that, I thank everyone for your time. I hope there wasn't too much repeat in there. And I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you. So yeah, we have a few questions. Glenn was asking that in a specific area, how much does the effort required each year go down? What's the cost going down after the first year of treatment to the second year?
Well, that is a great question. And I apologize. I don't really have the information because I've only been here 1 year for that. I guess what I could say is that I'd have to refer back to previously when I came here. It depends on the species, right? And it's going to depend on the seed and things of that nature. My screen is completely back, so I apologize if people can't see me. But so it is actually species dependent. Things like garlic mustard, which have a long residence time, are going to take a lot longer because not only are you working through the plants that are actually there on the site, you have to work through that seed bank. So unfortunately, I can't give you like specifics. But then there's other species I find that are much easier to control, such as honeysuckle or autumn olive. We find maybe, on average, a couple few years after that, if we have good cut stump applications that we're only dealing, in a year or two, we can deal with the seed bank that may have popped up. Now things like glossy buckthorn or buckthorn, which produce ungodly amounts of seed. I've seen mature buckthorn removed and it just becomes a field of young buckthorn. There we go. So while I don't have concrete numbers for you, I think it's going to depend on the species. And the main factor is what's the viability of the seed in the soil and for how long. And one of the other factors is how well did the person doing the application, do it in a manner where it was effective.
All right. Ethan asks a question that also works for Erin, because I don't think she covered it either. What's sort of like the process and what work is there being done for aquatic invasive species?
That is a great question. So for me in Montgomery County, I am terrestrial. We have an aquatic resources section, resource analysis, where really that jurisdiction would fall for that. So if Erin or Andrew have any input on that, I would welcome them to chime in.
I can chime in for Fairfax County, and it's the same as Montgomery County. We are right now focusing on terrestrial invasive species. Our Department of Public Works and Environmental Services, they do some limited non-native species control for invasive species that are found in stormwater ponds or are stream restorations. Or are blocking a waterway in some form. But as far as what we are focusing on at the Park Authority, our resources are tied up with terrestrial species. Once we run into those in the next 300 years, then maybe we can start looking at the aquatic.
All right, Andrew, you had something?
Yeah, I was just going to say it sounds kind of similar. Just the way the jurisdictions are split up, a lot of agencies kind of have that split between the water and the terrestrial. And our agency is no different. I always laugh because I tell people, working for the Bureau of Forestry, our sister bureau, State Parks, anytime there was a wet spot on the land that DCNR got, they dammed it and they turned it into a state park. So it's never been really a huge issue for our bureau to deal with those aquatic species. That being said, in Pennsylvania, we are trying to get a lot of those aquatic species that might threaten the Great Lakes onto our Department of Agriculture's noxious weed law to hopefully help cut down on the sale and transport of some of those, and highlight the need for resources to go towards those agencies that have more jurisdiction on their either in their landscape or within their authority.
All right, thank you. So one thing I've had several questions about is I will be posting a video of this. It's being recorded, as you know, and I just have to figure that out, split up the video, and also next week's video, which will be Andrew again talking about biocontrol, and then our small grants research program, and then the business meeting. So thanks a lot to our panelists. Damien will take over from now.
Thanks, Nathan. I'm going to hold my mic up so I can be heard better. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much to all of our panelists, and a big thank you to Juniata and Joel from Judiana, who's been who set up the webinar, and encourage everyone to join us next week. We'll be having another talk from Erin, and then our business meeting where we will go over the MAIPC's new grant program that we're just starting up for small grants. Mostly, I think we'll be focusing on small research projects, funding small research projects. So that will be on February 2nd. I think it starts at 2 in the afternoon. But if you got onto this email, if you got onto this webinar, the announcement for next week's is also in the same email that I sent. So I think that's all for today. Thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you again next week. And that's all. That's a wrap.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.